All right, let's just jump right in. In the 20th century, there was this one guy whose ideas crashed over the entire landscape of Christian thought with the force of a natural disaster. It just ripped up all the old certainties and reshaped absolutely everything. And that man was Karl Barth.
One writer put it just like that, calling his work a theological tsunami. And you know what? That's a powerful image, but it's really not an exaggeration. Barth didn't just tweak a few ideas here and there, he triggered a massive, seismic shift. So, who was this Swiss theologian anyway? And what was it about his thinking that was so completely world altering? That's exactly what we're going to unpack right now. Okay, so to understand the wave, you first have to understand the world it was about to hit. See, Barth wasn't just writing in a vacuum. He was responding to a theological system that he was convinced had totally lost its way.
I mean, the debate over who Jesus really was is ancient. It goes all the way back to the earliest church councils trying to figure out his divine and human natures, then through the Reformation. The question just never went away. And by the 1800s, this long conversation had led to a powerful new answer: liberal theology. Now, liberal theology was basically an attempt to make Christianity respectable, to make it fit with the modern scientific mind. It pretty much argued that God isn't found in some ancient supernatural book, but within our own human reason, our own ethics, our own religious feelings. It was a very human-centered way of thinking.
And this is where you can really see the battle lines being drawn. Liberalism saw God as immanent, right here, close by, inside of us. Barth would come along and thunder back that God is transcendent. He's wholly other. For liberals, truth came from human insight. For Barth, no way. It could only come from God revealing himself. And Jesus, he wasn't just some great moral example to copy. He was God's one, singular, definitive word to all of humanity.
For Barth, though, this wasn't just some stuffy academic debate. It got real. The breaking point was World War I. He just watched in absolute horror as his own beloved, esteemed liberal professors all signed a declaration supporting the Kaiser's war aims. To Barth, this was it, the ultimate bankruptcy of a theology built on human goodness and reason. It had just failed, catastrophically. And so, the wave crashed. In response to everything he'd seen, Barth developed a brand new center for all of theology. It's a complex, kind of mind-bending idea he called the Christ event. So here's the crucial point. For Barth, the Christ event isn't just the stuff that happened in the life of Jesus. No, it's God's single, eternal act of self-revelation, divine human reconciliation, and the very definition of reality itself. Okay, that's a mouthful, so let's break that down. First, and this is a big one, this isn't primarily an event in our history books. It's an eternal becoming that happens inside God's own being, where God chooses to become man and takes all of humanity into his own life. It's an act that happens within God himself. Second, Barth makes this really important distinction between two kinds of time. There's history, which is our normal linear clock and calendar history, but the Christ event happens in what he calls Geschichte, or God's time. And this is the brilliant part. God's time only touches our history at a single point, kind of like how a tangent just greases the edge of a circle. It intersects our world, but it's not contained by it. And third, this one single event becomes the key to understanding everything else. For Barth, you don't understand God or humanity or sin or salvation by looking at them separately. You only understand any of them by looking at them through the lens of this one all-defining Christ event.
So let's look at the ripple effects, because an idea this big is obviously going to have some pretty shocking consequences. I mean, if everything is defined by this one transcendent event, what does that do to other core Christian beliefs?
Well, let's start with the Bible. Barth wrote this, and it's a direct shot across the bow of a lot of traditional thinking. He is arguing that the Bible itself is not the revelation. See, the traditional view is that the Bible is the Word of God, period. But for Barth, that's not quite right. For him, only Jesus, the Christ event, is the true Word of God. The Bible is a fallible, very human witness to that Word. It's not that the Bible isn't important, far from it. It's that it becomes the Word of God whenever God decides to use it to speak to us. It's a subtle difference, but it is a massive one. Okay, now think about the typical story of salvation, the one we all kind of know. It's usually told as a sequence of events, right? A perfect creation, then a historical fall into sin, then God sends Jesus into history to fix the problem, which leads to our redemption.
nice and linear. Barth just blows that whole timeline up. He argues these aren't separate steps in human history at all. Nope. They are all just different facets of the one eternal Christ event that's happening in God's time. Creation, the fall, and redemption are all happening simultaneously in that single divine act.
And this leads to some really provocative claims. For instance, he completely rejected the idea of a historical Adam who fell from some perfect state. In his view, there never was a golden age. The first man was immediately the first sinner. The problem of sin isn't some historical accident, it's just part of the reality that God deals with in the Christ event from all eternity.
And of course, this raises a huge, and I mean huge, controversial question. If God's act of reconciliation in the Christ event already includes all of humanity, and this decision was made back in eternity, well, does that mean everyone is saved, regardless of their faith? And this is just classic Barth. When people pushed him on this, on whether his theology leads to universal salvation, he gave this famous non-answer. I do not teach it, but I also do not teach it. He just refused to draw that final logical conclusion, and he deliberately left the church to wrestle with this profound and really challenging ambiguity. So in the end, we're left with a thinker who is just as complex and debated today as he was a century ago. His legacy is really a series of powerful, fascinating paradoxes. I mean, he gave us this massive, all-encompassing system built entirely on the Christ event. He very cleverly used the classic language of Christianity, but poured brand new, revolutionary meanings into the words. He single-handedly forced theology to turn its attention back to a transcendent God. But he also left us with a paradox, a God who, even in the act of revealing himself, somehow remains mysterious and hidden. His tsunami of thought is still sending out ripples today. And that leaves all of us with the same question Barth forces us to confront. In our modern world, a world so focused on what we can prove and measure in our own history, how do we even begin to speak about a God who fundamentally exists outside of it? It was the central challenge of Barth's time, and you know what? It remains the central challenge of ours.